All right, well, thank you all for coming to this, our second workshop in this area. Appreciate Dr. Eddie Snell offering us to come here and utilize this nice facility. So I'd like to start by just asking him to come up and welcome you to his home here.
I'd like to welcome everyone to Buffalo. You've come here in our 2 days of summer, so the timing is absolutely perfect. We're an independent medical research institute. We do a lot of structural biology here. Later on this afternoon, if anyone wants to have a look round, we have a high throughput crystallization facility here that works with about 1,000 labs worldwide. Dr. Sarah Bowman will be about. She runs the place. She'd be happy to show you around, and we're actually running today, so you'll see some anomalous crystals hopefully like appearing on the pictures there. We do a lot of research with X-ray free electron lasers. I can't officially say this yet, but we've just been renewed for another 5 years on a major grant from the NSF. It's a $25 million research grant that involves about 8 institutions, so not all of the work is done here. We also run one of the beamlines at the APS, the IMCA beamline, in collaboration with 5 of the major pharmaceutical companies. So that's what we do here, a little bit of microgravity stuff. I'd like to welcome you here, and I'd like to tell you the most important parts about the day. Coffee is over there, and the bathroom's around there, and if the fire alarm goes off, that's where the door is. So with that, I'm not going to spend much longer, just get to the stuff that we're all interested in. So thank you for coming. Thank you to CASIS for asking to come here and enjoy the day.
All right. So I think the last time we did this workshop, we split it over 2 days. And so with ACA around the corner and a lot of people trying to get up to Canada, we thought that it would be good to try to utilize this time to get everybody here and maybe try to do it in 1 day. So the way we've structured it is into 3 different sessions and kind of grouping the talks according to those sessions. Ideally, the way we would like it to work is that the people in the different sessions will come up, they'll give their talks. They're limited to about 15 to 10 minutes, but everybody had or submitted slides that were about 70 slides long, so I'm sure that will work well. And then we're going to hopefully hold off the questions after each of the talks and then have the speakers for the session come up and sit here on the assembly line, and then they can maybe field questions as a group. I'd like it to be very interactive throughout the day, with the goal at the end, maybe for the last hour, hour and a half, is to have smaller breakout tables. So if you don't get a chance to ask your specific question to the audience in general, we'd definitely like you to ask it at the group tables. Our goal to come away from this is to know how CASIS and the National Lab can support this effort, what we should be doing, what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, what we're missing, what the community really wants. So that's our goal from this. So with that, I'm going to try to talk as little as possible and let the people that know what they're talking about talk more. So, yeah. And so we already have complications. Okay, so this will be the first session, and as you can see, we've got 4 talks here. 4 talks in 15 minutes each. So I'm just going to go ahead and start it off and just have Dr. Jolene come up. And then April and Andrey and Eddie, if you don't mind, just when your time is up, just come on up after the previous speaker. So we'll just try to keep this going as quickly as possible.
All right, thank you, Mark. And I am guilty. I am the one of the people that gave 70 slides, but I think most of these slides I'm preaching to the choir, so I'm going to go rather quickly and then slow down on some of the important points I want to make. In about 30 years of my involvement, starting in the lab of Alex McPherson and the labs of Europe and my lab now, I just want to share with you some of the considerations that we've learned and I could give out from our spaceflight experiments. I'm preaching to the choir here, but I just want to remind everyone why we're doing this in the first place. And the notion is that in the microgravity environment, you have a convective-free condition, and in so doing, that you have a diffusion-limited environment, and thus you can have a better quality crystal growth. So everyone here knows this. This is the motivations behind this, and this shows some of the illustrations about the convective environments and how you can get a more uniform growth in crystals. So I want to start out by talking about 10 things that came up to mind, and like I said, I'll go through some of these rather quick, but these are just kind of notes to you. Choosing a protein wisely. There are proteins that will not crystallize well at all, regardless if you're on Earth or in space. And there are that will have remarkable differences. And the question is that what types of these proteins are there? And one thing I want to point out, one important thing, is that people, especially early investigators who are sending things to space, thinks that if they can't crystallize it on the ground, then there's a chance they will crystallize it in space. And I wholeheartedly disagree with that. Most usually, the crystals who don't grow on the ground usually will not grow in space. And if they do, there's a good chance that they would have grown on the ground anyways. And the reason for this is because protein crystal growth is decoupled into two processes. And one is a thermodynamic process, and the other one is kinetic process. The thermodynamic process doesn't change. The potential for it to nucleate here on the ground is the same as that in space. So if it doesn't grow on the ground, you really should not be considering it to shooting it up in space. So that's number one. The second thing is the kinetics issue, and this is what really microgravity will help you do. And that is that in the diffusion-limited process, this is what helps the most. And proteins are not rigid bodies, and I stress that because in the early days when physicists were involved, everything was treated as a round sphere. And proteins, because of its floppy shapes and flexible nature, you can't treat it that way. So a lot of this depends on the context and the diffusions really need to align with each other. And so proteins that are more susceptible to that will have a more effect if you in microgravity compared to those that are grown. So the second one is the stability. And I'm talking about chemical or thermal stability. Picking protein. Yes.
Earlier point, when you were talking about the attachment of protein crystals to one another, I think you were suggesting that they kind of pile on, right, molecule by molecule, but that was the classical theory that people no longer believe is the fundamental mechanism for protein crystallization, right? And actually, the most widely accepted theory now is the two-step nucleation theory.
So can we address that in your discussions? Yeah, and I do want to comment that further on. Right. All right, so the stability part is actually really, really important. Setting proteins up that are not stable during the duration of the equilibration process is problematic. So if you have a protein that will only be stable chemically and thermally within 3 days, you don't send that up for 30 days. This is actually pretty trivial because in principle, you should find this out in a lot of the preliminary experiments. And that's really one of the criteria we should be looking at in deciding some of the proteins we'll be sending up. So some of the sources of these types of thermostable proteins, the best ones I find are the ones that are from extreme environments. These are thermophilic proteins that are temperature resilient. Those seems to be much more rigid, and because of their stability, they can withstand more vigorous equilibration process, more extensive equilibration process, such as that in the microgravity environment. Here's some proteins in gallery, some examples that actually crystallize out well. Some of these did make it up in space, and they did remarkably well in the differences between the Earth and space. And many of these are stable. They're not all extremophiles per se, but they are proteins that are resilient to temperature denaturation. So I think in considering proteins that to send up in space, this is all to be a consideration. Know your protein. The old way we used to do is everybody purified their own protein. But nowadays, you can purchase proteins, you get proteins from your collaborators. So there's a bit of an unknown factor of where your protein comes from. And because of the unknown factor, you get a lot of variability. And these variabilities can come in different types and shapes, and mainly because of heterogeneity. And heterogeneity has been one of the problematic steps in terms of determining the variability of crystallization. So what do we mean by heterogeneity? And this is not just talking about contamination per se. In terms of crystallization variability, even in generality, we get two types. One that are contaminants from homologous and heterologous contaminants. So that means that if you have homologous, you can have proteins purified and it looks homogeneous on an STS phage gel, but in reality, you get different types of forms, and if they're partially denatured, they can themselves be a contaminant as well too. And heterologous is just outright contaminants of the source. So these can really contribute to the variabilities of these, and also compactness of these. If you know you have proteins with very large connecting groups, these are probably not proteins that you want to invest a lot of times in these, and without any type of very modifications and treatments. And aggregations is a really a big problem too, is proteins that aggregates readily are probably not good candidates to look at these. So the sources of heterogeneities are listed here. You can look at it, and I won't spend too much time, but only to say that in preparation to preparation, when you prepare for proteins, you must consider that each preparation, if you're comparing apples to apples, that they have to be treated the same, meaning that they come from the same prep, the same user, same lab, same sources. All this makes a difference in terms of keeping things homologous. Here's some examples of purity does matter, for example. So here's a Pyrococcus proteins that has different types of purities, and you can see even on Earth, you get a variability. And sometimes when you have variabilities like this, you could easily have mistakenly see proteins come out with improvements or not improvements that are attributed to its own environment. And so in terms of aggregation, even proteins, the time that it takes from the preparation to the crystallization setup will be important as well too. And here's an example of one. This is a methylase, and this is a fresh protein solutions right off the column. This happens to be a protein that is very susceptible to aggregation. If you leave it out on ice for about a couple of hours and then set it up, and this is repeatable, then the crystal quality changes very, very dramatically. So this is kind of an extreme case, but also common for proteins that have propensity to aggregate. So these are some of the things to consider. And a lot of these things, in terms of heterogeneities, a lot of the proteins that are partially denatured, we could prove these because we could actually do heat cuts and heat these up mildly and then spin down the heterologous solutions that precipitates out. And you get very, very different types of qualities. And this is an example for the model of lysozyme. Another one is dalmatin. So you can actually take your dalmatin and heat these up and spin these up, and you get very, very, very different outcomes. So this is just illustrating the variability of different types of qualities which comes out of this. And here is an insulin as well too. Insulin has been used quite a bit for microgravity studies. I just want to show the variability of insulin as well too for heat treatments of these. So the fractions of these are also indicative of the qualities of these. So here's some dramatic differences between heat cut solutions and non-heat cuts in terms of resolution limits. And here's the last one just to show you some differences in terms of diffraction quality. So in using proteins that we try and compare microgravity effects, I think this is really worth considering and important. Choose the proteins that have favorable intermolecular contacts. And I think this is related to the comments that you have made. I think you want to find conditions where you want to find proteins, preferably, that has in themselves high symmetry. And you also want to crystallize these things properly in high symmetry for practical reasons, because in high symmetry, particularly for neutron diffraction, you have less time for data collections and you get complete data sets out of these. Here's some proteins that actually crystallize very well, have shown very good differences from those that are grown on Earth into space. And these are particularly ones grown by Alex McPherson's and Canalin, STMB, hemoglobin, these are all PCNAs. These are ones that are very symmetrical. They crystallize in high symmetry groups, and they have profound differences with those that grows on Earth and in space. They are very sensitive to the crystallization conditions in a diffusion-limited environment. So, if possible, select your protein, and or at least gauge your protein that whether most likely you'll see a more dramatic effect when you see proteins of different symmetry. This is very important. Do your ground studies very carefully. Many people underestimate the ground study tropes. And so even earlier on, I've met many investigators who said, well, I have a whole year before launch, and 2 weeks before, they're purifying a protein frantically and trying to get steps. And this is a very, very poor comparison because, as I said before, there's a lot of variabilities behind it. So do the preparation. It will take about a year. Do it very carefully. Know the system. Know the behavior of your protein. Choose the geometry of your crystallization apparatus. This is hardware, and I think this is very, very important because one of the most, I think, common problematic errors are that you choose a crystallization chamber that is already non-convective in a non-convective environment. And I'll illustrate this point. So in the common types of crystallizations are vapor diffusions. These are solubility curves. I think everyone here understands these, but the vapor diffusion and also capillaries, free diffusion, counter diffusions, these are all the different types of processes that once gets crystallization. So these are just highlighting some of the software, some of the hardwares. These are just examples. If I don't show any of your hardware, don't get offended, but I just want to show you, illustrate historically what's been used. These are APCF reactor from Europe, very much the same as the Americans' free diffusions of these. And these are large volumes. There are about 200 microliters of these, the free diffusions for these. These are some of the vapor diffusions apparatuses that has also been used. And a lot of these have worked well in terms of providing a environment, a chamber for crystallization. Now, I'm going to stress on this because this is the one that we've flown as well too, and the one that I favored a lot, and that's using capillaries to use counter diffusion. This is the Granada crystallization box. It's very, very simple, and it's basically in a capillary and a counter diffusions of these. So let me just slow down and make one important point. There are a lot of people that thinks that having very small diameters and having many of these would be a very productive way to go. Well, the problem is that in terms of capillaries, you do not want you do not want a small diameters. The narrow diameters of these capillaries, meaning less than 0.2 millimeter in the inner diameter, will provide a non-convective environment already. So if you send this up in space, you will not find any differences to those if you're on the ground. So these are examples of do not choose hardwares that has non-convective environments already. The biggest examples we've seen is that using large diameters and you see larger differences. If you put these into a narrow chamber where you already have diffusion and limited types of processes, you will not find any differences. Okay, so also there's a temperature-induced hardware that's been used historically as well too, using temperature as a variable. Okay, be prepared for launch scrubs. Right? So this has been probably one of the most frustrating experiences because of the variability of the launch time. So choosing your proteins and having enough of it that you are prepared to either make more refill things on the fly or that they are resistant to staying on the launch pad. All these must be considered in terms of looking at your proteins of choice on these. Be prepared to have things, lots of materials. This is a protein costly type of adventure in terms of having enough materials to replenish. This is one of our fillings on these, and I think that the examples of a lot of these scrubs are pretty typical. No fault to anyone, it's just because of for one reason or another. So it took us 3 tries to actually launch in one of our experiments. The first time we were very excited. I had a whole team, about 5 people, driving from Huntsville all the way down to the Cape. When that got scrubbed, the second time wasn't as enthusiastic. I had 3 people going down. And then it didn't take off. And then the third time, only myself went down. Right? That took off. Right? And so just be prepared for these kind of things and pick your proteins well for these kind of preparations. Post-flight recovery, right? And this is what I find is the most amazing thing, is that there's a lot of time and expenditure that's used for the preparations, for Earth preparation, for the flight preparation. By the time it comes back on Earth and it gets into your hand, there is a big differences in types of the treatments of these. Starting out from the recovery all the way to the manipulations of the crystals. All of these can affect your protein crystal quality independent of the benefits of the microgravity effect. Right? So here's an example. This went up for 6 months, and here we are in a parking lot with this bag, and that's where we're at. Right? After here, we're responsible. So we're in a car driving in California, going through the airport, going through security check, going through TSA, opening it up, turning things around. All these happens. And so a lot of these preparations, no matter how well you prepare for, no matter how early you call the airport security to let them know that this is coming, there's always these problematic steps. Like I said, a lot of expense up front, but at the end, you're just left with the bag, and it's actually in a lunch bag, and that's what it's carried in, at least in our case. And in some cases, you have temperature control. But when we're back in the lab, depending on who handles these proteins will make a big difference. All right, we have a weightlifter in our lab that actually handles it very delicately, surprisingly, in terms of mounting crystals and so forth. And we have a very soft-spoken technician that handles these crystals very roughly. And of course, these provide variabilities. So as I said earlier on, make sure the same people works with it to make consistent analysis of these. So that comes to number 9 when doing comparative analysis. Compare apples to apples. If you really want to see the effects of microgravity, look at crystals perhaps of the same size, same volume, same reflection points. Right? And this is a work we've done earlier looking at same HKL reflections and looking at mosicities for these. Snell has done a lot of these types of mosicity diagrams as well too, but looking at same reflections, looking at similar volumes of crystals will give you pretty good comparative distinguishments of the qualities of these. Right? Go to the same beamline, collect at the same time if possible. These are some typical Iowa Sigma resolutions. Collect as many crystals. Earlier on, we didn't have this benefit of shooting up many crystals, so we didn't have the statistics, but now we do. So and look at as many crystals as possible for these. And for electron density maps, as I said, some of the ways we can look at is take crystals with the same volume, even with the same resolution cutoff. Now, even though you have crystals with better resolution, look at them with the same cutoff and look at the same sigma cut and see the electron density differences. All these we have, in the case for an organic pyrophosphate, the one we recently flown, 19 amino acids, an exception to histidine. We've looked at areas of these. And the reason cysteine is not on there because this particular protein did not have cysteine. So in a lot of cases, these are very good comparisons for these. All right, so the last one I'm going to leave you with is grow large volume crystals for neutron crystallography. and with all the intense beam lines and the resources for the synchrotron lines, we do not need large crystals anymore. In fact, we can use micron crystals as little as 10 microns or less. You can get structures of these. So unlike 30 years ago, where large crystals were beneficial, it's not as important anymore. But neutron crystallography still has that issue because of the flux issue, and that requires large proteins. Why is neutron important? For those of you who are not familiar with it, the X-rays, unless you're going really high resolution, you cannot see hydrogen atoms. Neutron provides the definitive location of hydrogen atoms because 50% of atoms are hydrogen in proteins. I think this is important to look at. We have made a lot of investment. We, meaning the government, the countries of many, not only the U.S. but other places, have invested in a lot of government facilities like Oak Ridge National Labs and neutron resources. So what is missing? We need protein crystals to use it for single crystal diffractions. And for structure-based design processes, I think looking at hydrogens and active sites are really important. So all these are pretty important, but large volume crystals are not as important anymore for X-ray crystallography, but I would argue that it is still very important for neutron crystallography, and I think this is where the value is of using the space station for that goal as well too. And here's some examples of the one we grew. This is in capillaries, like I said. These are actually very large crystals that we've got after 9 months. Here is just really quickly on the neutron maps for these that shows a water network that we could not otherwise see in the X-ray structures. And my last one here just really shows you the electron density map of the X-ray. Look at the water, the oxygen density here. And you can see it's sort of a network, and unless you see the connectivity that's revealed by the neutron structure, we cannot look at a water network that's fairly visible, which led us to deciphering some kind of mechanism for its activity. So here's just examples of some thoughts. So I'm going to end here, and like I said, this is just kind of a quickly, just 10 types of considerations, probably lots more. I'm going to keep this short, but just to let you know that this is kind of an accumulation of what I've thought in my last 30 years or so in various labs, including Alex here with Richard and Juanma and all the people I have left working on this project. So thank you, and I'll look forward to having a discussion more.
All right. Thank you, Joe.
There's so many slides.
Yeah, no, nicely done. All right, here she goes. Thank you. And then April, if you want to, so we're recording everything.
Okay.
So when you're up here, yeah, try to speak into that.
Okay.
As possible.
Good morning, everybody. My name is April Spinale. I'm with CASIS, and we wanted to give you a brief overview of where we've been with PCG research with CASIS, where we are right now, and where we're going. So where it all began, kind of surprisingly enough, PCG was the first request for proposals that CASIS ever put out back in 2012. And so we had 5 PIs selected for that. And so I'm just going to go over basically the hardware, what we did, show some fun pictures, and give you an overview of all of this. So SpaceX 3 was our first flight. That was the flight that Joe was talking about that we scrubbed many times. It was really great. We never really knew what was coming next. We didn't really know when our next launch was. So NASA planning for launches wise has gotten a lot better on that. We really have a better handle now. But at the time, it was a little bit of a challenge. This was the first flight of the handheld high-density protein crystal growth hardware from the University of Alabama, Birmingham. So I'll do shout-outs. There's Rob Rouleau, so he's the man over there if you want to talk to him about HPPCG. But this hardware had flown before in a bigger container, and what they did was they made it into a handheld version that could fit into NASA's cold storage hardware, and it enabled a lot. We don't have to have a powered locker to get it up there. And so it's just a small version that has a lot more flexibility. And so the way it works is it keeps the protein and precipitant separated, and then the astronaut uses a little crank on orbit. It's just a little handle tool, like an Allen wrench. and they introduced the protein and precipitants together. And so our PIs were Pamela Borkman and Gwen Owens from Caltech, and then Steve Aller from the University of Alabama at Birmingham. And the Caltech group was looking at the Huntington protein for Huntington's disease, and Steve Aller's group was looking at a medically relevant membrane protein that's involved with cystic fibrosis. And so just a couple, the picture on the right is of Dr. Aller filling in the cold room, and the one on the left is kind of my favorite because it's Gwen Owens and Dan Connor and everybody in the cold room. And again, we got smarter that we started filling the samples a lot closer to launch, but at the beginning we were filling them early, and so they had to keep going back in that cold room, and so everybody's got their jackets. And the girl on the right, Ashlyn, she looks like she's at the North Pole, so it was a little chilly, but it finally launched off. And as Joe mentioned, the Granada crystallization facility, he was a PI along with Sergei Korolev and Eddie Snell. And so they launched on SpaceX 3, and they had samples come back on 3 and SpaceX 4. And he already did a great job talking about that hardware, so I won't go into it too much. And we also had on there from Merck Research Labs, we had an unsolicited proposal fly, also using the HD-PCG hardware. And that PI is Paul Reichert, and they were looking at a monoclonal antibody that was developed for a treatment of an immunological disease. And so there's one cool shot here of on the left of the HD-PCG floating in space with the astronaut's hand, and then of Paul. Luckily, I got the one that we could do at ambient, so we were filling at ambient. But we got smarter too, but he wanted his samples, to be loaded. We had a lot of samples to load, and so we were loading about 2-3 days before launch. And that flight we had, they had a fire at the range station. It wasn't like bad weather. It was just these weird every day, and they'd come in, oh, nope, it's not going today. So we'd reload, and coming in the middle of the night to washing hardware. So as Joe said, the last 2 flights have been spoiled because they've gone off the first try, and it makes it look so easy, and everyone goes, oh. But it really can be a fun and challenging experience. For PCG2, which was our next one, that was from the University of Toledo, and that was on SpaceX 4 with samples returning on SpaceX 4 and 5. Also HD-PCG, and they were looking to do neutron diffraction studies, and just a picture of, torquing the caps and of that hardware on station as well. And the PI was Connie Shaw, and Tim Muser was working with her at that point, so if you have any questions about that, you can find him. PCG3, back to Merck, and they flew on SpaceX 5, Paul Reichert again with the monoclonal antibody. And they flew the HD-PCG, but they also wanted to see they were working on a drug at the time. They weren't telling us what it was, but they wanted to fly some of that solution in a glass vial. And this is kind of an illustration of NASA's, they're really trying to accommodate more and more things, because before they would have said, no way, we're not going to fly a glass vial, but we were actually able to wrap it in bubble wrap and stow it away, and it was approved to fly. And so they just wanted to see, does microgravity, does the space environment affect any of the storage properties of their drug? And they, this is a picture on the bottom of Samantha Cristoforetti activating this hardware on station. So we do work now. We have, good capabilities, getting cool pictures for you too of your hardware in space. PCG4 was Eli Lilly and Company on SpaceX 8. And the PIs were Christopher Gonzalez DeWitt, who's back there, and Michael Hickey. And they were flying a medically relevant membrane protein that they didn't tell me what it was either. And also HD-PCG. But this was the first time that we've flown a commercially available piece of equipment called the mitogen plate. It's an SPS-compliant 96-well plate. And so you can see on the upper left, they're filling in the lab. Then you got the astronaut with the HD-PCG and the plate that's just in the bag. And then Chris and Mike turning over at cold stowage, it's a very exciting time to bring your samples and officially hand them over after all that work. And then a picture of the mitogen plates floating in microgravity. PCG5, back to Merck Research Labs. They've been pretty busy with us. SpaceX 10. And this one was an interesting shift because instead of kind of keeping it a secret, Merck was very willing and wanting to share what they were working on. So they were actually working on the monoclonal antibody that's in their cancer drug Keytruda. And this is a pretty big deal for us and for them because, you know, a lot of this stuff that we work on is kind of a mystery. You never, especially from pharmaceutical companies, you don't really hear, they're not really publishing. You don't necessarily hear what they did. And so this was an exciting thing that we kind of knew now what we're working on. And instead of structural work on this, they were really interested in drug delivery. And because the Keytruda drug is, it's working well, but it's obviously very expensive. It's, I think, $100-something thousand a year. And a huge part of that cost, about 40%, is the facility that you have to pay for. So you have to go in and get an infusion with a nurse, and someone has to drive you there, and that's a huge part of the cost. So what Merck's really working on is getting small, highly concentrated crystals, and that they could put into an injectable drug that you could either get at the doctor's office or actually get it at a pharmacy and be able to give yourself the injection. So that's really what they were looking on in this one. And so they use the HDPCG, but also the handheld protein crystallization facility, which is batch crystallization hardware, again, from the University of Alabama Birmingham group. And it's 1 ml vials that are mixed before launch. And Paul has a lot of temperature control. He uses a lot of the cold storage hardware up on station to adjust temperature slowly on a gradient over time. PCG-6, Oak Ridge National Lab. So that launched on SpaceX 11 and returned on SpaceX 12. And Andrey Kovalesky over here is our PI, along with Zoran Radic, who's from UCSD. And they were flying acetylcholinesterase in the HDPCG hardware. And just a couple other pictures on the left, you can see the astronaut. This launched cold at refrigerated temperatures, and the cold storage group has these phase change packs that warm up gradually, and they unpack it when they get onto station. So that's what it's just basically a big cooler that they unpack and then transfer to whatever hardware you need next. And Andrey filling samples there in the lab. PCG-7 was from Michael J. Fox Foundation, and that flew on SpaceX 12. And the PIs were Stefan Knapp, Sebastian Mathea, and Marco Baptista, and they were looking at a protein involved with Parkinson's called LRRK2. And this is the first flight of the microlytic crystal former optimization chip from Anatrace. So we have Eddie and Ann here too from there, and they have a table around the corner if you want to go see their hardware. This was a true ship and shoot. The PI was in Europe, and he shipped the samples to me frozen on dry ice, and I basically took them and gave them to NASA and launched them, and they went to ambient and then came back with the crystals. So it was a pretty easy experiment from my perspective and from NASA's perspective. There's on the bottom, on top, you can see a picture of the chip, and on the bottom is Peggy Whitson taking it from the freezer on station. PCG-9, Wisconsin Space Crystals. It's fun that I can actually point out that everyone's here. So Ilya Guzai, back in the back, University of Wisconsin-Madison, they launched on SpaceX 14. This is a really fun one because these are middle and high school kids that they won a contest on the ground that grew the best crystal, and then they got to fly their experiments in space. So we happen to have 3 girls that came down. It was just really exciting time. Their families came, lots of fun, and they flew copper sulfate and potassium phosphate samples. And this one was all commercial hardware, cheap stuff, syringes and Teflon bags. And the samples were, pretty benign. But what we were able to do is put them in a big plastic bag that we just heat sealed so it was kind of like a little glove box for the crew. And they were actually able to, depress on the plunger and the syringe and do some manipulations with the samples. And we got crystals in all the bags. And what was really neat about this one was we actually got a call. The astronaut recorded a greeting right here from the cupola talking to the students. So that was really neat. And then we got some really cool shots from the, with the Earth in the background. It's pretty neat, especially for a middle high schooler to see what they worked on. And we also put our fingerprints on the labels and put them on there. So they have some cool souvenirs from that one. So, but they had a lot of good success and a lot of fun on that one. PCG-11, Oak Ridge National Lab. So now we're in the current phase. We launched on SpaceX 14, and they're currently all on ISS, returning on SpaceX 15, and 3 HDPCGs return on 15, and 3 more return on SpaceX 16. And so Andrey Kovalesky's team again with the acetylcholinesterase and the HDPCG. There's us at the bottom at turnover with the cold storage folks happily handing it over, and I think that one won on the first try, right? So that was nice. So PCG-13, the in situ space PCG. Now this one's an interesting one because Craig Kundra at NASA, I think he's coming.
He's going to be here.
Okay, so he actually had a really great idea. We had a period of time that we had extra crew time, and it kind of came up quick, and so not everybody could respond fast enough. A lot of the hardware and the science is just not ready that fast. So what he came up with is an idea of, hey, is there something we can do? Can we have the astronauts fill the dishes in space? So we launched the samples up in little, Erlenmeyer type or Eppendorf type flasks, and then they use a pipette on station to fill these 96 well plates, the mitogen plates. And then the astronaut can use a microscope on orbit to see how it's going and then return. Because as you've heard and seen, a lot of the hardware we have are basically black boxes. We don't know how it's working. We launch it, we hope for the best, we bring it back, and we either got the best or we didn't, but how do we know when that happened? If we didn't get crystals, is it because of the return? Did something happen? So there's just no feedback. And we also have a lot of investigators whose proteins crystallize, within a couple of days. And so they can't freeze them beforehand. So they really can't sit on the ground and wait for a launch and the time it takes to get to space station for 5 days. So the idea being that we launch these samples separate, the crew pipettes on orbit, and we return the sample. We look at the samples on their scope and bring them back. So on this one, we launched on SpaceX 14. It's currently on ISS, and it's going to start in August, returning on SpaceX 16. And I will give a shout out to Carl Carruthers at Nanorex, because we also had 2 of these through NASA, and so Nanorex was one of the groups, and they've already done some of the filling, so hopefully he'll tell us a little bit about how it went. But Christopher Gonzalez-DeWitt with Bionetics now is our PI. We're doing lysozyme, and this is just going to be very interesting. It's a great idea, and I hope it really works, and then it's very popular. A lot of people are interested in doing it. I think my worries are you have astronauts who have either tons of experience with pipettes or they have never seen a pipette, and so getting them to pipette 2 microliters of a drop in space, we'll see how it goes. But it's an exciting capability if it works. And we also, Chris has developed, he's worked with the mitogen folks to develop a modified version as well that we're testing. So we're testing 2 different versions of the hardware. So that'll be something interesting to see and more to come. PCG-8, University of Toledo, back to Tim Muser now is the PI, so he launched on SpaceX 15 and is currently on ISS. And Tim got to an interesting issue, is that the Granada crystallization boxes aren't made anymore. So Triana in Spain was making them. They don't make them now, but they just hold glass capillaries and they're just a plastic box. So Tim came up with an idea, you can see on the top, of putting a glass capillary in a polyethylene bag and heat sealing it, and that's his, and then we put it in an outer box. So he kind of came up with a creative workaround on that one. And this is just a crew member unpacking them right after launch. So again, it's always cool to see your experiment floating up there in space. And then future flights and partnerships. We've got for SpaceX 16, which is currently scheduled to launch on November 29th of this year. We've got Tim Muser Part 2, and we've got Michael J. Fox Foundation wants to try again, and this time they're going to try to have the astronaut fill with a mitogen plate. That's where we're headed right now. We've got David Chung from Dover Life Sciences that's launching mitogen plates, but they're pre-filled and they launch frozen and thaw out when they get up there. And then we've also got a couple of National Cancer Institute researchers that are interested in flying on this flight, so we'll try to make that happen. And then SpaceX 17, Elia's University of Wisconsin Space Crystal Contest is an annual event. So luckily we're going to get to fly another group of kids' experiments next February. And so we do have a lot of proposals in right now that we're reviewing, and our partnerships with National Cancer Institute and Oak Ridge National Lab as well for the time with the neutron diffraction facility is those are 2 other partnerships that we have. And I have my last slide is questions, and since we can't take any yet, I'm not going to.
All right, thank you, April.
Thank you.
Okay, my name is Andrey Kovalesky. I work at the Oak Ridge National Lab at the Neutron facility. We have 2 neutron diffractometers to do macromolecular neutron diffraction called Andrey and energy. I'm going to talk about our project on acetylcholinesterase, which is NIH Counteract funded a pretty large consortium project that consists of Oak Ridge, UC San Diego, Ohio State University, and University of Utah. And the overall goal of this project is to design better antidotes for organophosphorus compound inhibited acetylcholinesterase, either nerve agent or uh, pesticide inhibited acetylcholinesterase. And the part that we play in this project at Oak Ridge is crystallography and neutron scattering. So what we're trying to do is, and why we think that space crystallization is beneficial for this project is that we want to do room temperature active crystallography instead of cryo to eliminate the factors of flash freezing of crystals. And neutron crystallography is usually done at room temperature as well to see hydrogen atoms. So first, a bit about the protein itself. Acetylcholinesterase resides importantly in synapses of central and peripheral nervous system, and it degrades neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Very interestingly and quite ironically, for a healthy individual, if you inhibit this enzyme, this leads to detrimental effects in health and at very bad cases, death if you use nerve agents or pesticides. But for an Alzheimer patient, you actually want to inhibit this enzyme because there is just not enough of acetylcholine that's produced, and you need the cholinergic receptors to work for the patient to alleviate the symptoms. So this is the chemical reaction. The acetylcholine is basically hydrolyzed into acetate and choline. This enzyme, very interestingly, is one of the most active and the fastest enzymes in nature, with the kcat of about 10 to the power of 4. It catalyzes about 10,000 reactions per second. But its active site center, the catalytic serine, resides at the very bottom of a long 20 angstrom gorge, and the acetylcholine has to come in through several places to actually react with serine. And this is important because when this enzyme is inhibited by organophosphorus compound, the reactivator has a hard time to enter this gorge. So these are the examples of the catalytic serine inhibition. You can have serine, soman, and VX reacting with the catalytic serine to produce phosphorulated enzyme, which can then age through the radical, through the cation abstraction and produce this phosphonuric acid that actually cannot be removed from the active site. There's a lot of work going on to be able to reactivate the aged enzyme. Well, but if you use pesticide, most pesticides are organophosphates. So they have all the oxygen atoms around. So you have phosphorylated enzyme that can also age. And these are examples of the used and still used pesticides. For example, the dibrom here, Nailate, was a couple of years in the news, big news about the Zika virus and the mosquitoes that were biting women in Miami. And what they did, they sprayed the whole area in Miami neighborhood with Nailate, but then found out that Nailate can be very detrimental to pregnant women, to their children, and they stopped doing it. But also hundreds of thousands of people in the world die through organophosphorus poisoning, mostly through pesticide poisoning. Most of it is suicidal, but in third world countries, it's accidental as well. There is much less death recorded for your agent use, but recently everybody knows the news have been flashing with novichok compounds used in UK and so on. So US takes this really seriously, and NIH has this counteract program to find new antidotes. So the antidotes mostly the ones that reactivate, actually, not just the ones that alleviate the symptoms. The one is called pyridoxine or 2-PAM. It's the only FDA-approved uh, reactivator in the US. In Europe, there's another one, but here it's the only one. It's been known since the 50s, and after 60 years of research and thousands of compounds synthesized, we don't have a better one, really, that would have um, better activity, less side effects, and so on and so on. We think that we can design better reactivators by looking at the very details of how this enzyme works at atomic level, how these reactivators actually enter the gorge and reactivate with new methods, including room temperature diffraction, which is coming back to crystallography after completely forgotten about 15 years ago. But it's coming back because people are finding that flash freezing may introduce artifacts in the crystal structure. And also neutron diffraction that can see the hydrogen atoms. So this figure shows the gorge. It turns out to be that the active site is pretty large. The, the volume is large, but it's very, very narrow in entrance, and it has a choke point at tyrosine 184. So reactivators have very low rates of reactivation. They do not cross blood-brain barrier very efficiently. So new ones are necessary to design. And our approach is a combination of X-ray crystallography and neutron crystallography. And that's because, as Joe Ing said, neutrons can see hydrogen atom because they scatter off nuclei, X-rays scatter off electrons. So with hydrogens being mostly in very polarized bonds, in strong hydrogen bonds, usually it's impossible to see. And even if you have ultra high resolution structures, the most interesting hydrogen atoms that actually play important roles in chemical reactions that happen in proteins. It's very rare that they can be seen in ultra high resolution structures. But with neutrons, deuterium, which we use usually to improve the signal to noise ratio, has basically the same scattering power as other elements. There's no problem with having light atoms and heavy atoms with neutron diffraction, which is important for metalloenzymes, for example. And also, neutrons do not cause radiation damage at energies that we use for diffraction. So this is an interesting cartoon we did 2 years ago that shows how we combine X-rays and neutrons into one funnel to produce a single joint X-ray neutron structure with all the atoms present and directly observed from experiment in the structures. So with this enzyme, this is a human acetylcholinesterase. It's a notoriously difficult enzyme to work with, and to Joe Ing's points, it's the one you don't want to work with to grow crystals in space because it's glycosylated, it doesn't crystallize well, it aggregates, and it doesn't diffract well whatsoever. So we were able, though, to produce two very interesting room temperature exostructures from this enzyme by growing crystals on Earth. These are the first room temperature structures for this enzyme. So this shows the active site with an experimental antidote, the reactivator RS2170B bound. You can see the catalytic serine. This is sitting at the peripheral site on top of tryptophan 286, and the oxime group, that's the chemical group that attacks the phosphorus, is rotated away from the catalytic site. But then we managed to use VX analog, obviously not the VX itself, to obtain a room temperature structure with VX bound. And we found that this the reactivator rotated 180 degrees towards the catalytic, the inhibited serine, but it's still looking a little bit away. So we propose that this rotation is an important part of the mechanism. It has to happen for the reactivator to work. And I want to say that the only reason this is possible for this type of crystals these days is because of the new detectors that synchrotron beamlines now install everywhere. The iGate detectors are the only reason we're able to produce room temperature structures, even at this resolution, which we want to improve with the crystals from space for this enzyme. And here I want to show what we think about how this works. So the ethyl group of the VX sitting on the catalytic serine is gatekeeper, so it keeps the oxime away, and then this the catalytic histidine actually is pushed away from the oxygens of the VX. So the oxime group has to rotate about 180 degrees itself to attack. But what the protonation state of this oxygen is, we don't know. What the histidine protonation state is, we don't know. Everybody thinks that this oxygen is OH. And if it's OH, then where does the OH go? Because it has to be O minus oxygen 9 to attack the phosphorus. And for that, we need the Neutron structures. On Earth, we were able to grow these crystals. So these two are for another complex with a different reactivator. These are pretty large, about 1 millimeter long. This one is quite thick. The crystals with the RS2170B that I just showed grow into usually trigonal prisms that are long and not very thick. But they're trigonal hexagonal, so they don't diffract so well. And this is the best neutron diffraction that we got at ILL in Grenoble, France, with the best instrument there. It diffracts to about 4 angstrom. Most of the crystals that produced neutron structures so far, if they are of this size, they would give you a 2 angstrom resolution structure very easily. And this one doesn't. So we turned to CASIS. We're pretty new with CASIS. We only flown twice in 1 year, but we are thinking ahead of what do we do next and what other methods we should use. So these types of pictures we saw, April took us quite close to the rocket that time. I'm not sure that was half legal or something, but we were very close to the rocket, and this is the astronaut putting our H.D. PCGs into the incubator. So this time we used the the vapor diffusion, HDPCGs, and learned a few things and trying other things as well. So this is one of the things we learned. When the crystals came back, there was like showers of little useless crystals. And we scratched our heads. We kept the crystallization trace for a while and found that after a while, the protein kept growing crystals in the drops. So we figured that the protein didn't go there for enough time. We also think that one of the biggest issues with sending protein crystallization experiments to space is that in most cases you combine the protein and precipitant on Earth. You wait 3-4 days before it goes to space, and then in case of HDPCGs, you activate vapor diffusion. But the protein had been with precipitant for 4 days, or maybe 5 days. And in our case, we learned that after a week, even with this low concentration precipitant, this protein starts to grow these little crystals in sort of batch mode, even sitting in the lab. So we are working on other methods. First one is the one that team user at Toledo is inventing. So this is the capillary crystallization using a membrane with a specific molecular weight cutoff. These pictures are for aspartate aminotransferase, and this is the crystal we grew at Oak Ridge over a month using this method. So in this case, the membrane was about 3.5 thousand Dalton molecular weight cutoff, about 150 or 200 microliters of solution of sample protein in a 2 millimeter inner diameter capillary in this solution. It has PLP, the vitamin B6, so that's why it's yellow. And this rubber tube actually holds the membrane at the end of the capillary. So over a month, a really good big crystal grew, and we actually just recently took it to ILL and collected a Neutron data set on it. So we're trying the same with with acetylcholinesterase, and we're learning that even if we use a much smaller molecular weight cutoff with PEG, it still goes through the membrane very efficiently. So even a PEG 6 and 3.5 thousand molecular weight cutoff membrane doesn't stop it at all. So we're going to even smaller molecular weight cutoff, 2,000, keeping the PEG 6,000 in as a precipitant. And we also have started working with PEG short, specifically with Paul Todd, who's sitting here, on redesigning their AdSep, BICEP device. I'm not sure how to call it right. But this, I think it's a very good design for batch crystallization. It has two plates on top of each other with wells in each of them, and they are stacked together. So two wells face each other. If you rotate in a staggered sort of configuration, like here, each well doesn't see each other. So in this setup, you can send the protein to space with precipitant not mixed with the protein at all. So if the protein doesn't aggregate and doesn't precipitate in 2 days, 3 days, it would be good. So Paul redesigned this right now, and we're working on more redesign this the wells to have inserts with that are shaped domed here and like a cup here with a magnetic stir bar, so that you could stir and mix the solution after they rotate to the activated mode. And this hole here is on the top, like shown here, to add the sampling. It's a very new design, and we're working on doing a better design, because once you start actually trying it with real protein, real precipitant, you find that there are issues. We have to redesign more. I want to thank Mark, April, and Ray from CASIS, and everybody from CASIS for organizing and inviting me here, and Paul and Rich and others from TechShot for working with us on this. And I want to thank, of course, NIH for Counteract program for funding this project, and this is our team from for this project. Thank you.
Thank you. And got Eddie. Yep. And then after this, we'll have four come up for some Q&A, which means Eddie, you've got like 3 minutes.
3 minutes.
No, I'm just kidding. Take your time.
I'm going to take my 15 minutes. So I'm going to talk about some surprises that took place when we've been doing some microgravity experiments. Because all of this is public and because it's being recorded, I'm not going to present some of our latest results, but I will tell you a little bit about them before I start. We're doing work currently in the light microscope module, and Bill Myers will be talking a little bit about that in a bit. And we think we've got a method that can identify crystals that, or proteins that will improve in microgravity from observations on the ground. It looks to be very promising, but we're working on the publication for that at the moment. And the other thing is we've been working on is a novel metabolite proof enzyme, or proofreading enzyme. This was work originally with CASIS quite a while back. It's about a 450 to 500 amino acid protein. It crystallizes in a tetramer of trimers. It's been a nightmare of a problem, and we finally have that structure. And very interestingly, from the structure that we've got from that, we also know that a couple of related things in the PDB are completely mistraced. So we're writing that up at the moment. But I started off in working on this quite a long time ago. You won't be able to read any of these, but there's a lot of references that are available online if you want to look them up, and they're also hyperlinked in the electronic document that you've got here. I'm going to focus on a few key results. We have a nice review article, I think, about crystallization in microgravity that you'll see some images in other talks, some trends from microgravity missions. I'm not going to put up some data on the cryocooling of insulin crystals, but I will tell you about that, and a few other things. But I'll let you, if you want to read it, you can go to those things. Basically, if it's not published, it didn't happen. You've seen this one from Joe's talk, and this is, I think, Alex McPherson, you came up with this idea about the depletion zone many years ago. So this is Alex's the explanation about what microgravity does to actually improve crystallization. It causes a halo around your crystal. It has very uniform diffusive transport to the surface, and that's proposed to be the reason why we see some cases where microgravity crystal growth improves the diffraction. This can be observed experimentally, so it's not a theory. This was work by Mark Busey in 1992. It's a Slyrin photograph of a crystal growing on the ground. It's a lysozyme crystal. And you can see this plume of convective flow that's actually going past the surface of the crystal. So this occurs on the ground. It does not occur when you get to about 10 to the minus 5 G or less. Now, this was an experiment we did on the Eureka satellite. This was launched on STS-46 in July 1992. The acceleration was only about 62 micro G. We had video observation of the crystals that were growing here. Unfortunately, there were cooling problems on this satellite, so there were no crystals that were actually returned. There was no X-ray analysis. But what we found that was very interesting was something that fluid physicists knew about for a long time, and that's Marangoni convection. These are pictures of the crystals here, And if we plot the pictures of the crystals, the positions of the crystals over time in the drop that they grew in, you can see that you've got this circular motion here. Now, we don't have that many observation points. All we can see is that we have this trajectory that's built up here. But if you look at the theory of Marangoni convection, basically what it describes is that the distance between your precipitant and where your crystal is growing causes a surface tension difference. And this means that you get convective flow that's actually set up in the vapor diffusion method. Now, I am not saying that convective flow is damaging. I'm not saying it's actually beneficial. I think if you're trying to grow very large crystals, it's very nice because your crystal is always moving into new nutrients. Depending on the speed of the flow depends on how damaging or beneficial it is. And we certainly know there's been improvements in vapor diffusion crystal growth, but it's something to be aware of. I believe, if I remember correctly, that Larry DeLuxe's group in Birmingham have used a circular precipitant reservoir here, which actually minimizes the difference in the distance between the drop surface, and that will minimize Marangoni convection. So vapor diffusion is the most common method of crystallization on the ground. There's lots of reasons to use it on the ground, but this was a surprise that was up there, that there's a big change when you take it to microgravity and you remove that gravitational the acceleration effects. Evidence for long-range order in crystals. This is work where we did some topography of some lysophyme crystals that were grown in space. And what you're seeing here, this is an individual reflection, but very highly magnified. And this used nuclear emulsion plates, so it's about a micron per pixel effectively here. And you can see that within these crystals here, you have very, very clear domains, blocks that essentially build up the crystal. And what we noticed from microgravity growth is that the domains were very uniform, very large, and very, very well defined. If I showed you the Earth-grown equivalents, and they're in some of the papers I referenced there, all it looks like is gray. It's not this nice, crisp, black diffraction. Unfortunately, when you cryocool crystals like this, you actually destroy the quality of them. So cryocooling something that is a very perfect crystal, when you bring it back to the ground, removes a lot of the benefit that you actually get from microgravity. And Gloria Borgstall, who's sitting here, and myself have done a number of experiments on that. And there's another paper in that list there. Influence on X-ray data. I won't go through this slide in too much detail, but it's the evil sphere here. And for those of us who work with it, I tend to call it the evil sphere. But basically, you have a contribution of the mosicity to your reflection. You have a contribution of the bandwidth of the X-ray system that you're using, a contribution of angular divergence, and if we pull it out into 3 dimensions, you have a contribution of stress and strain. We've actually done some measurements on looking at the mosicity of crystals, or how the crystal interacts with the evil sphere. And this was grown on STS-65. I see this picture in so many talks now because NASA actually have it as one of their images. So I usually go up and tell people I was a very proud graduate student when I got that. But this was grown by dialysis in the Advanced Protein Crystallization Facility. It was a dedicated microgravity mission, and I'll get to the importance of that in a second. And we analyzed this at the European Synchrotron Radiation Facility. As you can see from the size of it, it would be hard to put this kind of thing on the space station. And this is a very, very intense X-ray source. We collected data at room temperature. Use a 6-circle diffractometer, so it's very different from your regular kind of data collection. And you'll notice this little orange thing that's sitting there, that's a little bit of Kaptan shielding. These crystals were so perfect when we looked at them that the vibrations from the air conditioning in the hutch here actually affected the measurements. So we had to shield the measurements like that. This is what we saw. And when you look at this, it doesn't look that different. But when I tell you this is actually a log graph here, there's a huge difference. These are identical reflections from microgravity and ground-grown lysozyme. There's an 8 times increase in signal to noise, and the larger illuminated volume of the crystal only accounted for a doubling in that signal to noise. What really happened was the mosicity. That's the angular range of the reflection. the microgravity grown crystals had a mosicity of 0.0023 degrees, which is amazing because that's almost as perfect as the perfect semiconductor crystals and the crystals that are actually used for monochromating the actual beam. The ground had a higher mosicity, and there was agreement between several reflections and 2 crystals of each. So not quite statistically valid, but getting there. On a linear scale, it's quite dramatic. You can see the peak that's here of the microgravity crystal, and you can see the ground grown crystal. We had to use very specialized techniques to look at this. Because your regular detectors that you used at the time this experiment was done were CCD detectors or image plates. You take about a degree of oscillation for that. So you build up signal across this entire range when you're taking a single image. And that means that you build up noise, you build up noise, you build up noise, you see a peak, then you build up noise, build up noise. We've got some new detectors now, Pallades detectors and more recently Eiger detectors. And we can do continuous rotation techniques. And that basically means that you're collecting data at fractions of a degree. And if you're collecting data at fractions of a degree, when you're sitting on a peak that looks like this, you're just collecting signal and you're not building noise up. And that actually allows you to extend the resolution of what you're looking at if you have crystals that have very, very physically perfect order. So we can now take advantage of this. We don't need specialized equipment. Every beamline now has these facilities. That was lysozyme. This is insulin. And this is work with Gloria Borgstall from quite a while ago, a very, very fun period of time. Jeff Lovelace, Henry Bellamy, and myself. We grew crystals on the, these are crystals shown on the ground where you get some sedimentation onto the bottom of the growth container, some clumping. These were the microgravity crystals imaged at the same scale. They were free-floating, unsedimented, consistently larger diffracting volume. And we developed a way of, before we had these pixel array detectors, developed a way of actually looking at this mosicity in a statistically valid way. I won't go through the details. There's a nice paper, Understanding the High Mosicity Illusion by Henry Bellamy, who's here. And this is work with Walt Pangborn as well, who was, used to be a scientist here at HWI. And we developed our own program, Beamish. It's named after a very nice beer we found after we collected the data. And our version of the program actually has the logo of the beer, but we're not allowed to release that. So, but what we found is, in terms of the intensity of individual reflections, we have the microgravity grown crystals in blue, the ground grown crystals in red, and you see that there's a dramatic increase in intensity. Now that would be expected from the increase in volume of the crystals, and that will extend the amount of data that we can see. If I remember correctly, we actually have data to about 0.9 angstrom for the insulin. But the other thing that we saw is when we looked at the mosicity, and this is the mosicity here, you see that the ground-grown ones have a higher mosicity. And what that means is the reflection is spread about over a larger range on the larger angular range. So as you go through that angular range, you're collecting the data, but you're also collecting noise. The microgravity one is much smaller. That means that the reflections were sharper, higher intensity, and as you go through that data collection, you're collecting just the signal and very little noise. So there was a dramatic improvement in the crystal. Does changing the acceleration influence growth? We're all here because we believe that microgravity is going to give us an advantage. We are trying to prove a hypothesis, but not test a hypothesis. That's an important difference. So does microgravity influence what's happening? Well, this is a plot of acceleration. This is different frequencies here. This is different magnitude. This is while the crew are sleeping. This is while the crew are actually doing things on the space shuttle. There's some, the water pump has a very high frequency. There's crew exercise here, which has a low frequency. That's typically exercise in terms of treadmills. They're not treadmills, a bicycle that they use. And what we did was we looked at crystal growth. So here's some crystals that are actually growing, imaged in the APCF. And we correlated growth peaks with where exercise took place. And you can see here that every time you have crew exercise, you get a peak in growth. Crew exercise, peak in growth. Crew exercise, peak in growth. And this gets to the idea of having this depletion zone that's formed. As the depletion zone is formed, the area around the crystal is depleted of protein. As soon as something disturbs that, which is low frequency disturbances, you see that you get more protein that's brought to the surface and the protein crystal grows. As an aside to this, I presented this to the crew of this mission, and we actually identified the one crew member who turned the exercise thing down so they didn't actually do any work while they were riding it. So I'm not allowed to tell you who that is. We did a statistical, or we did an analysis of all microgravity missions. And these are the missions down here. This is the improvement in samples. So this is the percentage improvement that's reported that people said, I got something back which was better than the ground. Now, what's really interesting is that about this 40% line here, all these missions down here had something else other than microgravity, a microgravity dedicated science study. They were things that were chasing satellites. They were things that were deploying things. And the ones that had a dedicated microgravity environment were the ones where you had the most improvement of samples. So microgravity is definitely causing some improvement. You also want to demand that when you're growing crystals, you don't want to be growing them when you've got some kind of vehicular activity that's going on, and stuff like that. So crystals grown in reduced acceleration exhibit dramatic improvements in long-range order. That can result in a much improved signal-to-noise in the data, and it provides information at increased resolution. That's the bottom line. We want to know more about the biology of what we're studying, structural detail. There's another example here. This is Falmerton grown on the Mir space station. This was in the enhanced gaseous nitrogen dewar. That's a piece of apparatus that came from Alex McPherson's lab. Very, very simple, very effective, lots of samples that can be put into it. And the experiment that we're doing now up on the space station is based on a very similar principle, where you freeze the protein and the precipitant and you let it thaw in space. And we've got an advantage because we've got a microscope up there that we're actually following this process. But it accounts for any delays in launching. It accounts for any potential breakdown of your protein. And if you do a frozen experiment, you can choose the experiment to start at a period where you're going to be able to bring it back so that the crystal doesn't degrade. I'm running out of time, so I won't go into the detail too much. But basically, these are the ones grown on the ground. These are the ones grown in orbit. You can see, and this is signal to noise versus resolution. There's quite a difference, 1.25 angstrom versus about 1.35 angstrom, if we use that number. So even in that method, there is an improvement. What does reduced acceleration do? And I'll be very, very pedantic. I'm calling it reduced acceleration because you don't actually decrease the gravity. That's there. It's just because you're falling. The increase in volume due to the suspension of crystallization in a solution, it leads to higher signal to noise. We've heard some of the studies where it's been used for neutron diffraction, and that's a fantastic example of how microgravity can be used, or how large crystals grown in microgravity can be used. The other thing that we've heard is about cryocooling. Cryocooling destroys the perfection of the crystal. The other thing that cryocooling does is it traps residues in orientations that may not be natural orientations. And there's great work by Jamie Fraser from the University of California, San Francisco, that shows that you can get biologically incorrect information from cryocooled crystals. And that's the reason why a number of beamlines around the world now are actually producing beamlines that actually operate not at room temperature, but at physiological temperature. That's the temperature where life takes place. So it's important to understand that. And if you can grow a bigger crystal, you can use it for neutron diffraction, but you can also choose how you shoot it. So there are now microfocus beamlines. There's one being produced at the APS currently, which will be on the order of nanometers for the focus. You can actually go in and you can select parts of a large crystal and study it and reduce the radiation damage that's there, and study it at physiological temperatures. Reduction in mosicity due to improved physical perfection. You can actually take advantage of this if you record at angular steps that you can optimize the signal. And now we can do a continuous rotation. That angular step becomes effectively minuscule. We can take full advantage of what microgravity can give us. It's actually fairly depressing if you look at the number of proteins that have flown and the number of improvements that have occurred. It's a small percentage, but those improvements are real. And this is a nice graph that Craig Kundrop produced. This is from a review in Crystal Growth and Design #1. It was in the first issue, so I remember that quite well. But each one of these horizontal divisions here represents a doubling in the amount of data that was actually obtained because of growth or because of the resulting crystals growing in microgravity. And this is pretty impressive when you see a doubling, a doubling, a doubling, a doubling. That's a huge improvement, going from 6.35 to 3.17. 3.17 is not usable for pharmaceutical design, but it's a big difference from 6.35. And you can see these, for pharmaceutical design, you want to get above about 2.25, 2 angstrom here, and you can see that it's doing it. So it's giving a fairly positive effect. Physical parameters to consider in experiments. Temperature is crappy, to put it mildly. This is the temperature profile on the ISS. So this is one of our little temperature blocks that we've got up there. And you can see that you're going from, 19 is here to 25 is here. If you had an incubator in the lab that was doing this, you'd cry. So that's a problem. You need samples that are fairly temperature sensitive, temperature insensitive. And that gets to some of the extremophile stuff that Joe was mentioning. Can we predict what samples will benefit? The answer to that is actually yes. And some people have alluded to this in their talks about diffusion control and kinetic control growth. This is the work that we're doing at the moment. There's actually measurements you can make on the ground as crystals grow. And depending on how they grow, you can work out if it's diffusion controlled or kinetic controlled. If it's diffusion controlled, then microgravity will help it. If it's kinetic controlled, grounding motion is far more persuasive at that level. So I'm going to wrap up the talk now. I think I said this before, crystals growing in reduced acceleration have dramatic improvements in long-range order. That can result in much improved signal-to-noise in the data and provides information at higher resolution. Can we make use of these advantages? The answer is yes, but limitations still exist. Chemical compatibility. For those of you that have flown stuff, many experiments use components that are not classed at toxicology level 0 or 1. There was a proposal many years back to build what they were calling a bomb, which is basically just a big metal box that would contain anything above this toxicology level inside it. And that might be useful in the future. The lead time, it can be years between designing an experiment and launch. If you're interested from a commercial perspective, the time frame of a protein structural study for a pharmaceutical company is usually less than 6 months. It will, if you've not had success in that time frame, the project goes away. So a rapid turnaround is needed. Access time, materials have to be available and storable for long periods of time. Recovery, you don't know when it's coming back often. You want to arrange your most effective synchrotron time or exfil time for when you get the recovery. And that gets into the analysis as well. The unpredictable nature of return can make access to the X-rays difficult. So I've had 15 minutes. I've probably taken a little bit longer than that. I apologize. All the papers on this work are actually listed on the first 2 slides. They're available online. The whole papers are if you want to download them. If anyone wants to hear about some of the results that are up there at the moment, I can tell you about them, but our publication's not ready yet. And with that, I'm going to go into some acknowledgements. A lot of the laboratory-based studies. I had my collaborator, Russell Judge, who's now head of the crystallization lab at AbbVie. Fountain was Craig Kundrop and Cindy Barnes. Lysozyme was my graduate advisor, John Helliwell, Edgar Beckhardt, and Susan Weisgerber. The lysozyme topography was Titus Foggen, John Helliwell, Peter Siggins, Vivian Sturgeonoff. The insulin, a lot of the mosicity work was Gloria Borgstall, Jeff Lovelace, and Walt Pangborn and Dave Smith. I'd like to thank the staff at the University of Alabama in Birmingham, ESA, NASA, ESRF, NSRS, SSRL. What I've talked about was funding from NASA. What I haven't talked about is work that was involved with CASIS a few years ago, so I'd like to acknowledge them as well. And we are preparing a paper on that. So. And I think with that, if there's, do I get questions or does everyone get questions?
You all get questions.
We all get questions, so thank you.
Get all 4 of you up. All right, I'll just have all 4 of you come to the table. And probably have about 20 minutes or so for people to ask questions. And so as Eddie was saying, all the slides from all the talks are available on the workshop homepage if you haven't seen that already. And then we're also recording this, obviously, so that will all be available after. So, and the last thing I'll ask is that if a question's asked, if you don't mind just repeating it so that we can get it on the recorder. So I'll open it up if anybody has a question. Anybody want to start it off?
So, the insulin slide, I've seen that many times years ago, right? What I noticed this time is that you actually got a proof in low resolution also. What was the significance of that?
I think that it's due to the way you recorded the data. So, and Gloria may be able to answer it as well. So, sorry, I'll repeat the question. We got an improvement in low resolution as well as high resolution. Any improvement that you get from a reduction in resistivity or an increase in volume is not going to be resolution dependent unless it's stress or strain that's affecting the crystals. The trick is how you record it. When you're recording most crystallographic data, the dynamic range of the detector becomes very important. And many structural data sets out there, the low resolution data can be overloaded. So it's just the nature of how the data is recorded and the curve that was taken to actually do that. We're using an ADSC detector at the time, which has a very linear response from low to high intensity. And many people don't effectively record the low resolution data. So it's probably just because we've been working a few years on this experiment and we really knew what data we wanted to record there. Do you want to expand on that here?
We had a parallel beam. The beam was placing parallel. We could pass that some. I think in general the crystals were as perfect as we could do. And all of the reflections were good. So yes, we got everyone. But we really, I think what the exposure time was as brief as it could possibly be. So we did not really.
So actually, one of the things to comment on here with the new pixel ray detectors, if you can actually see the diffraction pattern, you've overexposed the image already. So the software that's available now, you'll notice there's actually been routines in the software that allow you to display 10 images at a time. There's a reason why they're there, because the dynamic range is so large that you need to bin them so you can see what you've effectively corrected. It's a useful point for people who use it.
They'll never let you unfocus the beam. Maybe an input.
They will never let you unfocus a beam on a simplify. Our experiment took 4 years, something like that, to do this. Yeah. However, X-fells are by their very nature unfocused. So you can take advantage of this if you can get on an X-fel. There's like 4 in the world, they only do 1 experiment at a time, it costs $500,000 a day to run. So, yeah, good project.
You are imagining the receiving text at what state they are and to be used by.
So the question is the 2 nitrogen plates that we have up. So yeah, they're up there now, and we're waiting for the astronauts to start filling them, which we're expecting August to start those. and then we'll get we'll wait a week for the crystals to grow, and then we take images. We'll get those down shortly after that, see how things are going on orbit, and then everything comes down in late December.
And what was the CT plate?
Generation 2 as well.
Okay.
They're up there as well.
And what really HPPC is for that?
That's okay. The handheld high-density protein crystal growth. That's the question was, what does HPPC stand for?
I have two basic questions on crystallography. Why do we need large crystals, and why do we need to collect data on them?
So the question is, why do we need large crystals to be able to select it? So large crystals is because the flux of neutron facilities is about 1 million times less than at any single. And for that, to compensate the 1 million times less flux, we go much larger crystals. Much larger crystals mean that we now in the realm of not even being able to freeze them. The larger crystal gets the harder it is to freeze it, just freeze it in whatever freezing security you're using. Even in helium gas, it's pretty hard to freeze large crystal. Plus, room temperature is a much closer temperature to physiological. It's already noted that we and others have shown that there are artifacts in crystal structures used to test freezing. And one of them, the biggest one of the very clearly noticeable is that in many crystal structures, the active side binds visceral or some other therapeutic, and it can even expel a ligand if you want. We certainly store it in our structures for crystallography. We do not want those artifacts, plus the artifacts in structural dynamics are important to understand how they function.
Can I ask a question? So this is true. For the where you're using the actual pipettes in the experiments there, are you actually treating the pipette section of anything to prevent leaking of liquids? Is that a potential problem? It's actually
So pipetting, absolutely.
yeah.
So pipetting on space station surprisingly is a new thing, and so Kate Rubin's actually one of the astronauts that flew not long ago. Actually brought pipettes up as her. The astronauts can kind of bring their own little things that they want to bring up, like little experiments. And so in her free time, she did pipetting experiments, and so there is some. I've heard that especially if you wait a little while, it does tend to wake up the yeah. So that's going to be a challenge we're going to have to overcome. I don't know, Carl, if you have anything that you noticed in yours, but it's a pretty new.
Yeah, it was pretty attentive to keeping the outside, make sure we have to and they were using the same tip over and over. So we would have to
This is just general. We used to do a lot of zero-G testing, C9s. Is there any thought of maybe doing some of that back to do some of those types of things? Because I think that would help.
Absolutely, yeah. The question was, do we plan on doing any testing with pipettes, especially on the zero-G type of aircraft? And I know that capability is still there. It doesn't. Now that we don't have a reduced gravity office that we used to have before, we basically have a zero-G plane. And I don't know that many people are doing that. We've discussed that with them.
Yeah. Yeah, there is.
That they've done it.
It was surprisingly successful.
Good.
It seemed like it was a small investment on our part just kind of do that quite
Right.
So you just kind of feel good about seeing it.
True, and it
Don't
would
do
give you
much
enough
about that anymore.
enough time to actually do it. So, it's a good point.
the hope of reducing microscopy limits. Can you tell me a little bit about the microscopy that you do?
So the microscopy work that we're doing on the space station, we're actually trying to decrystallize some stuff. So with crystallization, I talked about attachment kinetics and diffusion. We have a particular protein that's very well characterized and has lots and lots of mutations. What we've done is we've taken the native protein and then we've made it more sticky and then we've made it less sticky. So what we tried to do is promote kinetic control and to reduce kinetic control, so we have diffusion control. We set up quartz glass capillaries of this protein in a batch kind of crystallization method. That means your precipitant and your protein is mixed together. They were flash frozen on the ground at -8 degrees. They're sitting in a freezer up on the space station at the moment. And the last ones that we took up, the astronauts take them out of the freezer, they put them on the light microscope module, and we can actually image all these capillaries and watch the crystals as they grow. And what we're doing is we're monitoring the growth rate of the crystals. We're looking at something that's called growth rate dispersion. And growth rate dispersion is the difference in growth for crystals that are grown under identical conditions, the same well or the same experiment. If it's diffusion controlled, you will see a large growth rate dispersion. If it's kinetic controlled, you will see minimal growth rate dispersion. One is controlled by the fluid around the crystal, one is controlled by the attachment kinetics of the protein to the face. So we're studying that in microgravity. Our initial observations look to be very, very promising. It's what we hypothesized would happen. We did have some issues with X-raying the samples when we came back because of when they came back and when the synchrotrons that we were using was actually operating in the US. So the ones up at the moment, they're going to come back when the synchrotrons open, so we'll be able to look at the X-ray data. The interesting thing about it is this is a method on the ground where if you have a set of crystals and you observe them over time, you should be able to distinguish between the ones that should show an improvement and the ones that shouldn't. And the next sample that we're sending up are 2 samples where we expect these are medically related, biologically important samples where we think one is going to show an improvement in the microgravity growth and we think one is not. So it's a predictive technique.
Let's follow up on that question. What's the time scale of these observations when you mentioned that vibration and thermal fluctuations? So do you see that?
We can't do anything about the gravitational effects on it, other than choose the time period when it's actually operational to be in between docking points. If they do any kind of movement of the space station, that's going to have an impact. We have to take that into account when we're looking at the images because we'll see a spurt in growth in that, and that's part of what's caused some of our analysis difficulties, because we're trying to get the SAMS data, that's the Space Acceleration Measurement System, to actually correlate that gravitational clip with the pressure. We do see temperature differences. The particular protein that we're using is not that temperature sensitive, but it would have an impact on something that had solubility effects at different temperatures. So it's a simple experiment, and if it works, then we have to address all those other things as well for the future.
I have a question for both of you guys. I mean, I think that we appreciate that you guys are showing us what are some of the predicting what types of proteins we should be focusing on, maybe what are some of the other considerations when selecting proteins. So the question that I have is should we be focusing on that? Should there be a limited number of proteins that we even consider, and should they go through a checkpoint of, they have to be for neutron diffraction because there's no need to go to microgravity. They need to have these other properties. They have to utilize capillaries. Are we moving towards something like that, or are we too far away from that?
So the question was that what targets should we be looking for to really to make the experiments more meaningful at all in ISS? I always thought that to really make bang for the buck. I always thought about parsing the protein database bank and look at proteins that fit the criteria of what would be beneficial under microgravity. So, for example, we have about 100,000 crystallographic structures that's deposited in the PDB. So, what if we parse things like those that are high resolution, meaning 1 to 1.5 angstrom resolution, those that are chemically or thermally stable, those that are medically relevant, if that is important. And I think if you go through this parsing, you will end up with a group of collections of proteins that not only you know that will crystallize, and you could also look at, as I mentioned before, symmetry requirements too. Because for the Neutron data collection, which you want to see is in practice with high symmetry crystals for clear collection time. You don't want RE crystal to be monoclinic or triclinic, right?
It's not your choice.
Well, it's your choice if you parse it. Well, that's what I'm saying. So in answer to your question, I'm thinking reverse. It says, well, what if you take existing structures already out there that are determined crystallographically, and you take those and put them under the criteria that we talked about, and those would be good candidates for microgravity experiments, and for two reasons. One of them is what Eddie said, is most of them are collected under crowd conditions. So if you grow large volume crystals, it seems to be beneficial for looking at room temperature. You could take certain sections of these, and certainly for neutron structures, because neutron structures, there's only about 100 deposition right now. So I think, just thinking out loud, maybe that's the approach to get the bang for the buck as a community. We could collectively look at these, because since these are the requirements, ones that are more sensitive to microgravity benefits. I know Eddie may have a different take on it.
I still have a related take. I think it's important that you make the criteria for what can be successful out there so people know it. But I don't think you know what's in somebody's lab at the moment who can't get the answer they're looking for, as is looking for a way to go after that. So I think it's put out the advice on what this kind of environment can do for a sample, but then couple that with a good proposal process and knowledgeable referees, because you don't know what someone is going to propose there. And it may fit those criteria, or there may be another criteria that none of us here have even thought about, but when someone puts that in, then we'll be doing it.
So I guess just one follow-up. So are there enough criteria that you would feel strongly enough about putting out there publicly that this is a yes and this is a no? I mean, are there a list of those at this point? And do we work with the community to at least put those publicly for, behind our RFPs?
Stability.
Yeah. Well, certainly for Neutron, you need an existing crystallographic structure, preferably at a higher resolution. Usually, you go large volume, usually your extra crystallographic structure should be in order of 1 to 1.5 angstrom resolution. And well, most of them that you don't anymore. Well,
for neutrons, it's easy. For neutrons, people do not come to us as neutron fraction users unless their project is already in the advanced stages. Nobody comes to do neutron diffraction with protein they don't have structure, or protein that 6 angstroms, protein that's 2 megadalton inside. Nobody does that. It's definitely not going to work. Probably ever. So it's kind of easy there to choose.
So I guess right now I'm thinking in practical applications. If a good amount of the cost is to explore the protein's behavior and crystallization on Earth, what I'm saying is that within the time we have left to whenever the space station decommissions, is to look at a set of proteins that have already gone through that the knowledge of what's happening on the ground, and that is take a certain resolution requirement, things that are already deposited in PhD structures that are already known, and use those as targets, because you know crystallization conditions already. So you don't have to spend that year screening things like that if the data are truthful. And, so anyway, I think that may be a viable approach in terms of getting bang for the buck and the time span.
I wanted to jump on Joe's bandwagon and add that I think an area in crystallography that could benefit is that we have several crystals that have quite a bit of disorder in the structures, and it's quite possible that microgravity would allow those regions to be more ordered or change the crystal growth enough to do that. I have one structure I did, no matter how hard I tried, 50% of it was missing in the electron density. And I was actually thinking that would be a good sample to follow. You know which one I'm talking about, right?
So just to follow up, we have something up there right now to address that exact question. It's not the bacteria Ph.D, it's actually replication proteins. So we should cover it, right? But I'm hearing this, but our issue from the outside world is access. So now we're getting access, but it's also funding of projects. And so we have to deal with NIH or NSF to convince them for access to actual research. So the guiding premise for all of this is not whether or not it's a great crystallizer that flies in space. It has to have something like what Andrey's doing. So how do we match that? What would be nice is maybe have a mailing service and just send our boxes out to them and find them, because the huge amount of effort and money of coming down, setting up, is there a thought process like going through the Oak Ridge Neutron systems that get rights managed, so kind of time is that something you're utilizing?
For the Neutrons and Oak Ridge, we have a grant proposal approved, half approved.
It's approved, just working out the details.
So this it calls for a streamlined access of Neutron users to flight with CASIS. So if the Neutron user works with us and we say that this can be done, then we can work together. They should send this Neutron space without the user having to do a lot of work or having to have a lot of funding to do it. So once we started, we will finalize it. So for the Neutron community, anybody who comes to Oak Ridge will be able to utilize this service through us with CASIS. But for everybody else, that would be another.
Yeah, and I think that we'll get into this in the group talks, and we definitely like your opinion. I know Paul's shared it as well. I think some of the things that we've talked about is you can obviously provide letters of support to program that you're applying to. That say if the NSF or NIH funds it, CASIS will supply that whatever part we'll agree to supply. And I think that's a viable method. I think working with some of the government agencies, we've realized that in order to do a larger program, we have to convince the program officer to initiate that internally and put significant funding behind it. And I think maybe it's a program like Joe's where the community comes together, comes up with an idea, and sells it to an NSF program officer that we want to fund this maybe basic science program, and then maybe CASIS can get behind it and cover the other side of the equation as needed. But I think something like that seems to be a little bit more receptive than the one-off applications, and I know that it's difficult to get funding just in general to do crystallography work. It's a larger grant application, but I think we're interested in hearing ideas on how to get the funding to your side of the equation.
But the issue we hear is if it goes down to staff, and they say, well, I'm sure. Well, and NASA's a federal, they just look at the other agencies, separate entity. Why are they asking? And so it's so you have to work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that you guys are the experienced ones to know who are the friendly program officers that are potentially interested in this.
And the reviewers.
Yeah, but if we could get a special program dedicated that already has committed funds behind it, then we don't have to worry about that. But anyway, just ideas that we'd like to hear your opinions on. So, maybe one or two more questions from anybody for this group?
In terms of keeping this is totally different from the last couple of questions. In terms of keeping the precipitant solution separate from the protein solution, especially if you're using the dewatering method like drop, you always start with some precipitant present in the protein solution. And the question is whether it's worth spending a lot of time finding that place on the phase diagram.
My answer would be if you've got enough protein and enough time, it's worth doing. But for many of the targets that are out there now, the amount of protein that you have is minimal to actually accomplish that. So it'd be great to do if you could.
The other side is to always use a method in which there is no precipitant.
All right, anything else for this group?
What do you guys think about achieving morphology control on Earth versus on the space station? I know it's not something that you usually aim for, but what have you kind of observed is the morphology of the
I have not looked at that for any of the samples that I've taken up there. But you probably know the literature as well as me, but for dosing purposes, for our insulin crystals, they're all very, very uniform sizes. I don't see any morphology effects on changing something that was grown on the ground versus microgravity, other than just creating a uniform size. Or when you've got the initial crystals that's grown, sometimes you can get a secondary space group that will grow in the reservoir. That's all I've seen. I've not really looked at that. You guys have seen that?
Not seen any space group changes or.
So space group changes would be like the form, right? I was actually talking about like the physical shape of the crystal.
Well, if you use the same conditions, you shouldn't get.
Because, well, on Earth you have these, usually it's a convection driven to the surface, right? So if you do grow things in a stir tank in an industrial process versus in space, when you actually disturb the system, you cause the change, right? You reestablish that concentration gradient, makes it the concentration gradient greater to really cause a spike in the growth rate. Right?
That's correct.
Yeah, so that would change how, usually guys who are manipulating these processes to various crystal bases, you can change how the crystals look like.
But at the nanometer level, you've got a lot of other processes there which dominate any diffusive control. For example, Brownian motion and just the electrostatic forces on the molecules associated there. That has a lot of influence on it as well. I'm not saying it doesn't occur, but certainly for protein samples, I've not seen any major morphology changes between the two environments. I really don't know about small molecules in that.
Yeah, I think that it comes close that I know is that crystals that are very small, that are growing high symmetry, and they're allowed to grow large enough, they have sometimes they have symmetry breakdown. That's as close as I've seen something like that.
Symmetry breakdown meaning the symmetry of the lattice or symmetry of the shape?
Both. We had I've seen proteins that normally grow in large, small crystals in hexagonal, and then when they grow out, they seem to be in a lower symmetry group. And the morphology, you can see it reflects that as well too.
So in cases where you mix your precipitant and protein before you send it to microgravity environment, what happens the time period when you set up those plates and by the time it reaches the microgravity environment, if the reaction has already happened and the fusion has happened and the process is already it's that far that it doesn't really make much of a difference if it is microgravity now.
Some of it is temperature based, so if they have something that can slow down the reaction so that they can wait until they get out of it. So we can maintain a refrigerated temperature, frozen temperature. Joe with the capillary uses an Aguilar's plug that slows the diffusion. He came up with a really great timer basically. He could time it so that it would be diffusing, and by the time it got to microgravity was when it actually starts. So there's different methods, but some of them, as you know, depending on the protein, some of them really can't do that. So that's the challenge, and that's kind of where we come up with the real-time filling on station, mixing like you would in the lab.
All right, thank you guys. We'll take a 15-minute break. There we go. I think we are to